Paul, we definitely talk about this a lot on air, and I think
Yep.
safe to say at Bloomberg, right? About engaging, including, and benefiting all stakeholders. I think about the Business Roundtable. Now, is it like 2 years ago, it feels like?
Yeah, and that was news at the time when they talked
Yeah.
about it's broadening it out to include stakeholders.
Exactly. It's not just about returning money to shareholders. There's a new report out. It's called the Return on Purpose. It finds that those companies with higher purpose scores outperform lower outperforming peers on return on capital, valuation multiples, and total shareholder return. Those are things that will definitely get our Bloomberg Terminal users and
Right.
listeners their attention. Let's talk about it with Greg Milano, Chief Executive Officer at the consulting firm Fortuna Advisors, and Brian Tomlinson, Director of Research at CECP, Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose. Both of them joining us on the phone, but separately in New York City. Greg and Brian, nice to have you here on Bloomberg Radio. Let me kick it off with you, Brian. Tell us a little bit about this research report that you guys put together.
Yeah, so what we're saying in this report is that there isn't a natural tension between shareholder returns and stakeholder returns. Indeed, solid shareholder returns come from creating value from a broad set of stakeholders. So we looked at a large basket of firms and assessed them across a range of corporate purpose attributes. So we looked at whether or not they have cultural relevance, strong social commitment, whether they're taking a point of view, whether they're associated with positive values. And we found that those companies that have those strong brand associations are associated with really strong shareholder return characteristics across the piece. So we see that those firms have ROIC sort of plus 6% around that, above their lower performing or lower purpose associated firms, significant uptick in valuation multiples, and then just a really significant increase, as you would expect, given those initial metrics, in overall TSR for high-purpose firms. And I suppose ultimately what we're saying, as I said at the outset, is that, what we're not talking about is a zero-sum game of shareholders versus stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
What we're talking about is that shareholder value comes from creating value across a broader set of stakeholder groups.
So, Greg, certain industries more represented than others?
Well, the study is based on a scoring of purpose that was developed by Vera Brand Management. And what they actually do is they survey consumers about their perceptions along the categories that Brian just mentioned for different brands. And in order to be able to find these kinds of conclusions, what we had to do was to find what we call monobrand companies. And so they're companies that have predominantly their revenue comes from one brand, like Delta Airlines or UPS or Coca-Cola, that sort of thing. And so it's mixed across a variety of industries with a little bit of a bias toward consumer industries, although many of the consumer companies get excluded because they have so many different brands. And really none of the basic materials and things like that. So they tend to be companies that have brands in one way, shape, or form that are important to them.
We're hearing more and more about ESG investing and how important that is becoming to global institutional investors. The companies that you looked at here in your research, do they really get that? Do they understand the rising importance of that?
I think it varies. I think that there's a very strong interrelationship between companies operating with corporate purpose, companies caring about the ESG priorities, and companies caring about all of their stakeholders, not just their shareholders. They're all very overlapping and related sort of principles. And I think some companies take it more seriously than others, obviously. Some people think it's just lip service. Some people take it very seriously. I think what we've seen in talking with companies is some companies, it's almost like it's check the box. We want to make sure we're doing this and we're doing that so we can say we're doing it. While other companies take it more seriously and they think about investments to try and help the environment or one of their stakeholder groups, just like they would think about an investment in advertising or an investment in research or an investment in property, plant, and equipment. So they're trying to be efficient and effective still, and trying to provide the most benefit to the environment or the most benefit to their employees, per dollar that they spend. And I think the companies that do that wind up, being rated higher, but also producing much better financial results at the same time. So it's a matter of still thinking about these things as a business person.
So I don't know how much you guys can drill down, but I'm curious, Brian, do you guys have examples of companies that have actually done really well?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the Bearer framework, you can see companies such as Tom's and Instagram and Nike, Unilever associated brands. All I think you have a good performance track record. I mean, as Greg says, what we see is that there tends to be a strong association between those companies that are sort of deeply engaging with purpose and those companies that are also deeply engaging with ESG. Because we're really seeing this as kind of a whole firm concept. So it's from boards, all the corporate boards, all the way through to the brands. So, companies are kind of really embedding that in the way the board thinks about strategy, in the way sort of purpose is managed and operationalized within the business, the way people are incentivized, the way that companies then think about, who their key stakeholders are and how they can manage towards them in a way which is pro the sort of value creation that we're talking in this paper. And as an outgrowth of that, what these companies are then also doing is looking at their material ESG factors, not as kind of nice to haves, but what are the key things underlying our business? How are we going to drive performance, not just the next quarter, but over the long term? And we do see some pretty strong, robust evidence equivalent to the type that we deliver in our paper that says that, those companies that perform better on their material ESG issues and that have more sort of structured approach to managing their stakeholders tend to outperform their peer firms over the long term. So there is that sort of strong association and link between purpose and ESG and performance across the piece. But also the key to purpose as well, I think, is thinking about a time horizon. We talk a lot to companies about trying to manage towards the long term. So, yes, communicate your strategy and your results every quarter, but make sure that you're managing to create value over 3-5 years forward and beyond. And that's also the type of time horizon that you're going to need to think about when you're trying to assess your stakeholder impacts, which are probably going to be hard to have metrics available to assess those quarter to quarter.
So I do feel like this is a great working session for if there's a leader out there who's listening to us right now, or head of an organization, some of the things that they need to work on or possibly think about, Brian and Greg. Greg, what I do wonder is, what is the takeaway kind of for our audience who are largely sophisticated investors, understand the financial markets? What, based on the work that you guys are doing, is the takeaway or what they should be thinking about when they think about some of their investments?
I think when an investor looks at a company, this is important input for them. When a company speaks in a more of a long-term type of way, that should be a positive to the investor. They should still care about delivering results, but they should be willing sometimes to give up some results in the short term in order to achieve long-term objectives. They should care about ESG, and they should care about it in a way that shows in their actions, not just in their words. And they should care about stakeholders. I think the nice thing about the work that we did here was we used this Bearer database, which is actually based on survey data. Mm-hmm. We didn't, like smart people sitting in a room, sit around and say, how do we rate this company? How do we rate that company? Thousands of people rated them. And there's a strong relationship between brand value and the purpose scores. So purpose seems to be a really important thing to consumers when they're picking products. And that's something that should be really important to investors as well.
Yeah.
Brian, when the Business Roundtable report came out a couple of years ago on stakeholders, my first thought was, unless you incent senior management economically, financially, they will not change their behavior. How do you think about financial incentives for this type of change?
And just got about a minute left.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think you have started to see ESG type metrics appearing in executive compensation packages. Now, they're done in various different ways. Often it's somewhat qualitative in some areas, and for some companies where these metrics are available, you will have quantitative kind of ESG metrics attached to executive comp. So it's something that companies are starting to engage with. But, in the same way that we need to present this thesis that, stakeholders and shareholders aren't necessarily in conflict to the capital markets,
right.
We also have to do that to, the corporate management community. And hopefully this paper is part of saying that, there are these benefits, and therefore we ought to be able to reflect those in incentives going
right.
forward, yeah.
Right, and certainly something that's becoming much more a part of the conversation. I feel like it has been for some time, but this will certainly help amp it up. Brian Tomlinson, thank you so much. Director of Research at CECP, Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose, and of course our thanks to Greg Milano as well, Founder and CEO of Fortuna.